Welcome everyone to the Raise Center webinar. We will get started in just a moment. I know that there are a lot of people coming into the room right now, so we'll just give it like 1 minute. But we are so glad that you are here with us today and here for what I know will be a wonderful webinar. Okay, I will go ahead and get started. So, hello everyone, I'm Josie, and I'm the co-director of the Raise Center. We'll talk a little bit more about the Raise Center and other parent centers in a couple slides, but today we're talking about from high school to life, designing transition IEPs that reflect real futures. Miriam?
Yes, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. My name is Miriam Aliso. I am also part of the race team with the Josie, Lauren, Everett, Johan, Dawn. And I want to explain how to use some of the features that Zoom offers. And I forgot to say Maria, who is recording in the Spanish room. So we have captions for you provided by Zoom. If you need captions, just click on the CC over there. And we also have the Q&A feature. If you need to ask questions to the presenters, please use the Q&A feature. If you would like to communicate with us regarding any technical issues, please use the chat. And we have American Sign Language live provided by this Dina Hazen. And Dina has been highlighted here, pinned. And so if you would like to do that on your own, if you don't, it doesn't appear as um, pin, click on the three dots on her name and please pin her. We also have interpretation to Spanish. We have live interpretation. Tenemos interpretación al español. Para acceder al canal en español, vayan al globo que indica interpretación y oprimen donde dice español y luego donde dice Mute Original Audio. Esto último filtra completamente la señal en inglés para que puedan escuchar con claridad a nuestro intérprete de hoy, Guillermo. Okay, back to you, Josie.
Thank you. So real quick, friends, some of you may be new to parent centers, and so we wanted to give you just a brief overview of what parent centers are and what we do. And so there are parent centers across the country and territories, and so each state has at least one parent center, and those centers are funded to support families of youth with disabilities. And a lot of them have done a lot of work to also be serving youth with disabilities themselves. And so the map you see here are the different regions that are represented. So we have the SIPR, which it's sort of the umbrella that provides support to all of the OSEP parent centers. Then RAISE, we provide support to all of the RSA funded parent centers. So we focus on youth and transition to VR and employment. And then there are 8 RSA regions across the country that then support transition at the parent centers in that area. And so find more information by either Googling parent centers, going to the raisecenter.org website, or we can provide more after the call. Thank you. And so now I think we are going into our actual presentation. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But I did want to mention that if you have any questions for the speakers, feel free to add them in the Q&A. However, this webinar is full of information, so likely we will have to follow up with your questions after the webinar. But we really appreciate you putting your names and where you're from in the chat box. Always great to see where everyone is. So thanks, everyone. And I turn it over to our speakers.
All right. Well, thank you for having us today. We're really excited to be here and share knowledge from both of our organizations with you guys. And I will go ahead and just get started. I am Dr. Mindy Lingo with Think College. I am their training and technical assistance coordinator. Prior to entering the world of higher ed, I was a special ed teacher for almost 20 years, a transition specialist. And I also helped start a program at a university, and that led to where I am today at Think College when working with inclusive post-secondary ed programs across the country. And I will hand it off to you, Michael.
All righty, great. Thanks, Mindy. And I'm Michael Stoehr, and I work for the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the collaborative out of the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. And I've been in the education world for about 41 years. I've worked as a transition coordinator and led transition for one of the states for about 15 years and have been with NTACT, the collaborative, for about 8 years. But really thrilled that you're all joining us today. And with that, we're going to kind of dive in. I'm going to talk a little bit more about NTACT, the collaborative. And if you haven't visited our website, transitionta.org, I do urge you to do that. There's a wealth of information on our site, including recorded webinars. You can sign up for new webinars that we have. We do one of those a month. We have tons of resources, and there are separate sections on our website that are just for youth and families. We have a related site called Youth Engagement Now, or YEN. I'm going to talk a little more about that later in the presentation, as well as a section just for families. There are pages and resources for special educators, vocational rehab counselors, as well as other stakeholders. So if you haven't yet, please log into our site. You can register on our site as a login. You can also sign up for our weekly email news blast that highlights not only what's happening with NTACT the Collaborative, but also throughout the country, what other organizations and agencies are doing around secondary transition. So please check us out. And just a little bit as we dive into today's topic, transition is something that does happen throughout a person's life. And there are many, many transitions. So if you want to think about a youngster, as they start into school, they go into preschool and then into kindergarten into those elementary grades, to middle school to high school. And then really this life stage that we're talking about from high school to adult living. And some of those same areas or keys follow through. It's really understanding what that next environment's going to look like, what supports are there, and how best to prepare for those next environments. So as we talk about today, kind of keep that in mind that this is one of those transitional stages as students, youth leave high school and go into adulthood. Why secondary transition? And this goes back actually to the 1980s. And at that time, there was really a large disproportionate number of students with disabilities who were not attending four-year colleges or really post-secondary programs in general. They also were not staying in school through graduation. Dropout rates were really high, and their involvement in competitive integrated employment was really lacking. So back in the 1980s, they started looking at adding that as part of the IDEA process or the special education process. And it really is designed to assist youth, students, young adults to help best prepare them for the future so they can go on for further training, employment, and independent living.
All right, so I'm going to share a little bit about Think College and kind of explain inclusive post-secondary ed. I know that may be a new idea for some of you, and some of you probably are very aware of that, and that's why you're here today. But so Think College is the National Coordinating and Technical Center for Inclusive Post-Secondary Ed. Pardon me. We provide resources for students, families, educators, transition professionals, and many more. We really been highlighting a lot of information for vocational rehabilitation counselors lately, which I'm really excited about. And we do live and pre-recorded webinars. We have a lot of frequently asked question pages. And Think College website has tons of information, but if you go to our resource by topic pages, that's kind of organizes everything well for you there. And if you have any questions about that, we have a very receptive and quick responding technical assistance link there on our website. So we are the only national database of inclusive post-secondary ed programs. You can click on it. It's very interactive. It'll take you to all the state you're interested in or national. You can like your selections. It'll explain all the information about each program from costs, scholarships, applications, what the inclusive nature is of all the programs. So it's a very interactive program directory. And then also we have quarterly newsletter we send out, and we have very active social media accounts. So please follow us. And when we're talking about inclusive post-secondary ed is specifically its higher education programs, and we're providing access to this post-secondary education for people with intellectual disability. It varies. It can be at 2 and 4 year colleges. We do tech schools. There's dual enrollment programs where we have some students that are still in high school and accessing college campuses throughout their secondary experience. Most inclusive post-secondary ed programs consist of students taking classes there on campus. We really push for inclusive campus participation. They're involved there on campus, joining clubs, organizations. Some programs, the students actually live on campus in the residential living quarters they have there. Also, a big part of inclusive post-secondary ed is that work component. So students are working at internships there on campus or off campus, sometimes paid, sometimes unpaid, but they're working on those skills so they can gain employment after they finish their programming. Big focus is that career preparation, independent living, and community engagement. So why is IPSI? Why would we do this? Why is it important? Well, we've been around since 2010 is when we really started this big inclusive post-secondary ed push. It started prior to that, but with the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, there was actually some funding for inclusive post-secondary ed. And we were able to start taking data and see how beneficial inclusive post-secondary ed is for students with intellectual disability. And so it's really important to note that 65% of exiting inclusive post-secondary ed students had a paid job 1 year after completing the program. 67% 2 years and 68% 3 years, which I think is really notable and showcases how beneficial these programs are. The national average is usually about 15 to low 20% for that paid employment for students that are for young adults that aren't in inclusive post-secondary ed. So we are looking at a huge increase for employment for these young adults after they complete these programs. 73% of students that left their 73% of students exiting their program, they actually completed the whole program, which I think is really cool when we're looking at the national rates of students finishing college is for the traditionally enrolled student is like 54% for 4 year universities, and for 2 year community colleges, it's 31%. So you see these numbers and they're really impressive, and they're showing that what we're doing is working. But I think just one of my favorite numbers overall is that 85% of our students leaving programs reported that they were happy or very happy with their social life. And as a mom and just as a former educator, that number is huge to me, and that's something I really pride myself on. And so the next slide, this is a map of all the programs across the country. Almost every state has one now. We do have 2 states well, Washington, D.C., and then New Hampshire, which does not have a program right now, but we are working on that. And really, what's so cool is this map was from February, late February, but we've done some updates and reached out to programs. And right now, the number on our website is going to be 369 programs. So it's really cool to see how much it grows even within a month. So that you can see the numbers on our college search, the directory I was talking about, which you can find on our website as well. And so now we'll get into transition IEPs, and I'll turn it back over to Michael.
All right, thanks, Mindy, and that is fantastic. I can remember when Think College first started with those first couple of programs, so it's really
Yeah.
amazing how it's grown across the country. So we're going to dive in now and really talk about transition and that focus in the individual education programs for students that have disabilities. And the reason we really want to emphasize that and talk about the IEP as kind of a driving force is that for students that are of transition age, the entire program that they're involved with in high school should be focused on secondary transition. And it should really reflect those outcomes and futures for those students that we are working with. So when we think about secondary transition, it is a result-oriented process. And with that in mind, everything that that student is doing when they're transition age, and we're going to talk a minute about transition age, but that could be starting as early as 12 in one of the states that in the country, in Florida, they start at age 12. A lot of states start at 14. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the federal regulation is starting at 16. But regardless of when transition is starting, when that student is involved in programming, it's really looking at how are we best preparing that young person to go on for further training, competitive integrated employment, and to live successfully in their community. So everything they're doing, the classes they are taking, the activities they're engaged with, the interactions they're having with both their peers, the support personnel, as well as agencies, should be leading them to success once they leave school. It should be student-centered. So when we look at that, and we do talk about the IEP being individualized, it really is based on that particular student's interests, preferences, strengths, and needs. And really, that should be the guiding force of that transition process. It is also a coordinated effort, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that, that it does involve the young person, their family, the school, as well as the agencies and support services. When we look at the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, 2004, and that is the law that is governing special education for all students in the United States. When you look at that legislation, the very first paragraph talks about the primary purpose as why a student is involved in special education. And if you look at what is highlighted in red on the screen, it states that for every student, so this could be somebody entering special education as a kindergarten person, or maybe it's in middle school, but what we are doing with them, even from kindergarten on, is to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And that should be ringing a bell for folks because those are also the post-secondary goal areas, right? We're looking at going on for further education, employment, and then looking at independent living. So I want to highlight that because really, from an early age, this should be the focus and the driving force of what that student is working on in school, at home, and in their community. So when does transition planning begin? And I kind of alluded to this. So in IDEA, or the Individuals with Education Act, it does require that transition planning starts by the time the student reaches age 16 years. However, as I mentioned, depending on the state you are living in, it could start as early as 12, and we really do recommend folks thinking about this. You know, the young person, their family, those working with that young person, to think about starting as early as possible, talking about career pathways, talking about and supporting that young person and understanding their disability, the accommodations and supports they need, and having that forward focus on how can they live their best lives and be successful to go on for further education, employment, and live independently. And really starting early and maintaining consistency is so key as students move through elementary, middle school, into high school, and then go on to those post-secondary options. So we think about secondary transition, and we are going to follow kind of this bolded list for the rest of today's presentation. It does need to be student or youth, young adult driven. Remember, it's individualized. It does also take collaboration with the school. And when we think about collaboration, even within the school, it's that collaboration between special education staff, general education staff, and then if that young person is in need and support of additional support services like occupational therapy or speech language therapy, or physical therapy, those should all be interconnected, right? And they should be those supports that are helping that student achieve those best outcomes when they leave school. So it's a collaboration within the school, but then it's a collaboration with those outside support agencies like vocational rehabilitation and with students, again, that are of transition age, taking part in pre-ETS, so pre-employment transition activities that help support them. So the school is providing their services, vocational rehabilitation can providing pre-employment transition services for potentially eligible individuals. And families are really crucial too. And being engaged in this process from an early start and then throughout that process and supporting their sons and daughters. Age-appropriate transition assessment really is a basis for this process, and we're going to get into that and talk about the significance and how that really needs to be something looked at every year as part of this process. And then really looking at those post-secondary goals for further training, employment, independent living, looking at the classes, the courses that student is taking, looking at how the activities that student is involved with both in school, in the community, and those supported by outside agencies. How are those all linked, aligned, and coordinated? And then looking at the needs that that student has. What are those skill deficit areas that that student is working on? The reason that they have an IEP, right? That they need additional help. What are those measurable annual goals and making sure those align to the post-secondary outcomes, and then making sure that we are monitoring the process. So, I'm sorry, Mindy's going to talk a little bit about our student example because we're going to go through this process, but we're going to be using Ari. So, Mindy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I thought it'd be a really good idea. So we're going to be talking about a lot of things you can do as families, but to create a student example, that way it provides not real life, but almost real life idea of each step and really tailoring it to a certain student so you could see how it works. So today we're going to focus on Ari, a 16-year-old high school freshman with an intellectual disability. They participate in general ed classes where they receive support from their special education services for elective science and history. They do receive instructions in a self-contained classroom for math and reading. Ari is on a modified curriculum and will receive an alternative diploma. And I apologize if I know each state's a little bit different in the terminology they use. So this is the terminology I'm familiar with. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out about this. Their siblings went to college and they think it would be cool to go to college too. So they want to be a preschool teacher and live with roommates in an apartment after graduating. So that's just going to be the basic information about Ari. So keep that in your mind as we are going along and talking about the next steps in transition.
Great, thanks, Mindy. And you're going to see Ari. They're going to be reappearing as we move through today's presentation. All righty, so moving on. We want to talk, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, that transition really is a coordinated effort. That it does involve and is centered around that student, that youth that is involved in this process. And really having that young person at the center and as the driving force in this process. That what is happening with that student in school, in the community, and the activities they're involved with, that they are the driver of this process. I think too often in the past, things were being done to that young person or that student, and they were not actively involved and engaged. I still go out to schools, in high schools, and I'll talk to students that are in junior and senior year, and I'll ask them, hey, do you have an IEP? And they look at me like, what are you talking about? Or if I say, hey, do you have a disability? And they're like, again, what are you talking about? Or if they're able to say, yeah, I have an IEP and I have difficulties with reading. I don't always understand it. And then I'll ask the like $10,000 question. Oh, well, what do you do if you need help? And I get like blank stares. Or they say, oh, I asked my mom or I asked my dad. And not really understanding what accommodations and supports they need. So thinking about that, what are we doing? And if there are any young folks on here on today's webinar, what can you do to take a more active role in this process? So again, student-centered. Families play a really, really important part in this process too. being knowledgeable about the transition process, understanding that. And I do think it's really difficult for families. And I oftentimes will hear this from families. And it's the statement that, the days last forever, but the years fly by. In other words, it's really hard. I can't even think about what I'm doing tomorrow or at the end of this week. And you want to talk about what's going to happen in 5 years when my kid graduates. And it's like, well, yes, we do, because you need to start and really prepare and engage in that process. So families' role in this and their understanding and outreach and support is really important, and the alignment of what that young person's desires are and what the families are, and having those discussions openly. The education system, as I mentioned, is really important. And I did mention career and tech ed when I was kind of going through my list of general, special education, occupational, physical, and speech language therapy, but they're also a critical part of this. And how is that all being coordinated and talked about? And again, the agency involvement, like vocational rehabilitation or mental health services, those support service, intellectual disability services, how are those being coordinated? And then what is the involvement in the community? And I think the more we do this work, we also realize it's really important to understand your local community and what supports and services are available to best support that young person in their transition. So we're going to use this map as a guide as we go through today's webinar and kind of break this down into steps. And it's just a way of kind of looking at this alignment for secondary transition using the IEP as a basis for this. So we're going to talk about assessment and then kind of move through that process of the IEP. That's what those yellow boxes are. So looking at present education levels, looking at their course of studies, their transition activities, measuring young goals, how we're monitoring for progress, and then the fact that this is really an ongoing process. The other kind of road off that you see here is as a student gets ready to graduate from high school. So be that at 18 or if they're staying in school until they age out at 21, really looking at when that student leaves school. Another requirement under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is that that student is given a summary of academic achievement and functional performance as they exit school. And that's really kind of that last takeaway for that young person, looking at these are the things that work for me. It's my disability. These are the connections I want to make once I leave school, and how I can be most successful. So again, we're going to kind of use this and we're going to break down these steps as we've moved through this process. So thinking back to, we went through that list on that slide of these elements of secondary transition. One of those first pieces was that student, youth, that young adult was actively engaged. And again, that this is a student-driven process, that it's really based on that young person. And we're going to talk more about assessment in a few minutes, but really having that young person explore what options are out there. Oftentimes, young folks don't really know what options are out there, and they may look to their sports heroes or their singers. They want to go and be the next Taylor Swift, or they want to be the next football player, or, whatever those goals are. That's what they see. Or they may have a favorite aunt, or, maybe their dad is a doctor or their mom's a nurse. Well, that's what I want to do. And it's like, okay, but let's explore your other interests. And that's really where that career exploration happens, looking at what they're interested in doing, what their likes and dislikes are, looking at career pathways, really doing effective, transition assessment is so important. It's also important for young folks to presume competence. And what that term really means is not looking at that young person and looking at what their disability is and categorizing that young person and saying, well, you can't do that because you have X disability. And I think sometimes as adults, even in the most helpful ways, we could help support, wrongly, lack of independence, worrying about them making a mistake, worrying about that young person not being successful, because there is true dignity and risk. And when you think about your own lives, and I reflect on this all the time, I learn far more when I mess up something than if somebody's always there to kind of make things right. So by that, really pushing the young person, allowing them the opportunity to experience different things, different career options, different classes, and really push that envelope, not saying no, but saying, hey, how? How could we make this happen? How could this be successful? And then using teachable moments. And this is both in school, but I think also at home for the family members on there. Um, what requirements do you have of your sons or daughters at home? The students that I have found have been the most successful, and these are even students with really complex support needs, are those that have really strong expectations at home. They're required to do chores, they're required to cook, they're required to be engaged in activities that they're pushing that envelope. So thinking about that, is that young person involved in volunteering in different activities in their community? So really thinking about that student engagement piece.
And I just want to add something really quick, Michael,
Sure. Go ahead,
from
Mindy.
somebody that was involved in secondary education, then moved on to inclusive post-secondary ed. I will say that student-driven focus is huge, and you could really see a difference in our students that had like student-led IEPs that were involved, that advocated for themselves compared to the students that had not. And the parent expectations, you could always see a big difference in our students that were applying for programs, that their parents had high expectations, um, doable expectations, but also just that student, the understanding that they are capable and they're allowed to make risks. So I really just wanted to fo focus on that and how important that student-driven aspect is. Um, in application when you are having students there on campus. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mindy, for adding that piece. And when we talk with youth, students either currently in school or those that have recently graduated, they feel most engaged when they are being listened to, when they're able to make their own decisions, when they feel like they're being respected, and really actively engaged in the conversation, that they are an equal member of their planning and their team. Again, that things are not being done to them, that they're not being judged, that they're asked for their opinions, and again, involved in that planning process. And I think being spoken to in an age appropriate manner, kind of that equal playing field. So think about that and think about your interactions with the young folks that you're working with, either professionally or with your own, children that are involved in this process. Are they really actively involved? And are you taking a step back to help them drive this process? So I mentioned before about NTACT, the collaborative, and the fact that we support a website called Youth Engagement Now. We also have an organization or a group that was started about 6 years ago. It's called the Youth Engagement Transition Initiative, or YETI. And it's really nice on this screen. You can scan this. This will take you to the Youth Engagement Now website. But this is a really nice resource to find out how to actively work with and engage young folks in your programs, in your communities. A lot of really good resources can be found on our website. So I just want to highlight that as a resource that you can go to. And this is actually a site that's supported both with RAISE and NTACT. It's a collaborative effort to support YETI and our Youth Engagement Now website. So we next want to move on. So we talked about the importance of engaging that young person, that student in the process. We now want to talk a little bit about the equally important member or part of this is that family and the family engagement piece. Family engagement is important. It's from a compliance standpoint. It is in IDEA. So again, that legislation that's governing special education. It does talk about making sure that family input is included in the IEP. But meaningful participation also means meaningfully engaging that family in this process. And again, starting as early as possible. Families often will feel frustrated, and we hear this a lot, that really not understanding the process. Heard from families that they feel like there's some secret that the professionals know that they're not really privy to. And you show up in an IEP meeting and it's like, we don't really understand all of these pieces and what's happening. But I think sometimes families feel intimidated to actually say anything, just like their child may not feel comfortable in saying, hey, what's happening in this process? And one of the takeaways, hopefully, from this presentation is that when you look at your IEP or your student, your child looks at the IEP, that it's understandable and you understand this process and really can understand the supports that are there to support that secondary transition to adulthood, going again on to higher education programs, training programs, competitive integrated employment, living independently in the community. Um, so I think really looking at how best to support families in understanding this process and understanding what's available in their local areas. And it's important that we engage families in this process because families know their young person better than anyone else. So, some easy fixes to this from the education side are education folks using family surveys that are sent out to engage that family each year in asking questions about, what do you see as outcomes for your son or daughter? Where do you see them living someday? What are they doing at home? What supports are given? That's a really easy fix that some places do use, others don't, but that is something to consider because you're getting that family buy-in, that input, and then you can oftentimes match that to a student survey that is given, and it really helps to drive this process. But it's really important to include the family in this planning process and having that understanding of expectations but also what's available after that student leaves high school. So again, we're talking about this coordination. So we have the young person, we have the family members, and then the other player of this is really looking at education system and those agencies that engage in this process. By law, and in looking at students that do have IEPs, the school needs to invite agencies to that IEP meeting for students of transition age. But the caveat is that the parent needs to provide permission in order for those agencies to attend the IEP meeting. So I think oftentimes families are sometimes reluctant because they're not sure who these folks are coming in, if it's from vocational rehabilitation or another agency. But again, from a family's perspective, it's probably better to have those agencies there. It definitely is better to have them there to help in this planning process. So when those invitations come out, look at who is being invited. And if you don't see agencies involved, that's another, I think, discussion question to have as part of that IEP planning. Some examples of agencies are those that are included on this slide. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but they do include the vocational rehabilitation folks, including blindness and visual services, county mental health, folks involved with Department of Public Welfare. And again, these are probably different terms depending on the state that you're living in or your local area, but these are the general categories, right? So county mental health, public welfare that often includes programs for students with intellectual developmental disabilities, Bureau of Autism Services, Children, Youth, and Family Services, juvenile justice systems, the Social Security Administration, oftentimes the ARC or similar organizations like the ARC is involved. Centers for Independent Living, too, are another really crucial support that can be called in to an IEP meeting and looking at services and supports they can offer, as well as other disability-specific agencies. And over to Mindy. Back to our Ari.
Right. You guys are asking great questions on the chat. I'm trying to keep up with them. So just be patient. And if there's some specific to Think College, reach out to us afterwards and I will answer those. So who's on Ari's IEP team? Well, of course, it's going to be Ari. We want to make sure Ari's there. Parents, school staff, special ed teacher, case manager, general education, educators, administrators. But we also want to make sure we're going to invite those outside agency members. It could be vocational rehabilitation counselor. If you want to type in the chat, are there any other suggestions you might offer to sit in on Ari's IEP team when you're thinking about some of the stuff we discussed about Ari in the beginning?
All right, great, thanks.
Someone said school nurse is great. I
Yeah.
also think like maybe someone from the inclusive post-secondary ed program, if that's what they want to do, sometimes they will have availability to send staff. So
Cool. Thank you. And keep adding your questions, as we said, into the Q&A, or if you want to add any comments in chat. Thank you for doing that. Alrighty. So we're going to move now in and kind of back to this specific discussion about what's contained in an IEP for a transition age student. We're going to move in now and talk about assessment. So when we talk about assessment, it really is a crucial piece and it's a foundational piece in looking at the education program, but also the secondary transition process for a student that has an IEP. And I think some key takeaways is that it is a process that is not involving just one singular test. It's really a lot of different information that can be gathered from what that student is doing in the classroom, in the community, at home. And assessment should not look the same for all students, nor should it look the same for all students that have a certain disability. So say a student is in a life skills classroom, that doesn't necessarily mean that they all should be engaged in that same assessment. It should be individualized to that young person. The other thing about assessment is it should really look at what is that flow over the course of the years that that student is involved in secondary transition. We do have on our website, again, transitionta.org, a really well-developed transition assessment toolkit that includes a section for both students and families. And included in there are suggestions for different types of assessment that can be used. But when we think about the transition process for a student of transition age in the IEP, it's really a three-pronged approach that we look at. So first, it's really looking at identifying the interests and preferences of that student. And it really does need to be more than just asking that young person, what do you want to do when you grow up, right? Because as we were saying before, students really do not have a good understanding, especially if you're starting at age 14 and the student is in middle school, they're still exploring and discovering, but that's what the assessment process helps them do. It helps them to look at their interests, their preferences, the things that they don't like to do, their abilities, and kind of matching that to career pathways to see what makes the most sense for them. So it's identifying that. Then it's looking at, based on that assessment, what does that young person want to do? So say that this young person is really interested in going into culinary arts. They love the Food Network. They want to be the next Bobby Flay. Like that's where their heart's desire is. They do some cooking at home. So we look at that and say, okay, so that's your goal. That's what it's coming out. That's your interest. Then what are we doing to help you post-secondary? Are there programs that you could go into? Are there things that you should be doing now? Maybe the Career Tech Ed Center. But what are those post-secondary education and training programs possibly look like? What is that competitive integrated job that you want to have someday? It's probably not going to be Bobby Flay. So how do you start out and what direction do you go in? And then looking at that independent living area, where do you want to live someday as a young person? What skills do you need to be successful in living independently? Then it's really taking a step back and seeing where is that young person based on their ability and their aptitudes. And this is where that alignment comes into the measurable annual goals. So back to this example of this young person that wants to go into culinary arts, where are they as far as their reading ability, their math ability, maybe their organizational ability? And are we looking at developing those skills as part of their academic program with supports? So for example, if the student has difficulty in math, are they working on measurement skills? Or are they working on, maybe they have a problem following directions in more than one step? All right, so are we working on that? Or are we teaching strategies so that that young person could follow a recipe or could use measurement skills successfully on the job in the culinary arts field? So it's kind of breaking this down and looking at these steps. And where you would find this, as far as an explanation and looking at that IEP, that should be in present ed levels, really explaining what assessment was done and what is being worked on with that young person. So Mindy, over to Ari.
And I want to point out, we've had several questions about assessments, but today we really do not have time to get in there and discuss every single assessment and what's best for each student. But I know NTACT has some great resources about transition assessments on their website, which you can look that up there. And so for RA's assessments, I think we decided that it'd be best for them to have student and parent interviews, classroom observations, online career assessment, and aptitude tests to identify their strengths, and evaluations in school-based work settings, including the library, the student store, and as an office aide. So you can see there's just a combination of assessments. They don't all have to be really formal. You can do a big combination, have some formal and some informal. So, all right, off to
Great.
you, Michael.
Thank you, Mindy. I appreciate that. And just to reiterate again, if you go onto our website, as I mentioned, we do have an assessment toolkit there. We do offer some different examples that are available. And we should have probably mentioned at this beginning, Mindy, what we're talking about now could be a whole day presentation. So we are just kind of skimming the surface to give you a good outline about what these components are. Alrighty, so back to our where we are on our map and looking at the IEP. We talked about assessment, and it really is crucial. And you should have really good information, not only for what the young person wants to do in their future, so their interests, their post-secondary goals, but then also for the measurable annual goals. You should have really good assessment, or we call it baseline. In other words, that starting point. So if the student is working on, for example, reading comprehension, where is that information? Where is their starting point? Maybe that young person is reading at the fourth grade level and answering comprehension questions. That is a goal that they have. We know that's that starting point. And over the course of that IEP year, that's going to be worked on with that young person. So we're going to move now and talk a little bit more about present education levels, or present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, sometimes called PLEF. But this is that section of the IEP, and I personally think this is one of the most important sections of the IEP because this outlines who that young person is. It's the story of the young person, right? It's what their interests are. It's what their strengths are. It should be talking about what their needs are, and it should be based on data in informed information. So when you look at this slide and think about those present ed levels, when you read that IEP, is the information in there? Is it easy to understand? Is there baseline information? In other words, that starting point for whatever measurable annual IEP goals that young person has? Is there information about what is being worked on regarding those post-secondary goals for further training, employment, and independent living? Is there information from the family included? And do we have a clearly identified idea of that young person's strengths and needs? And again, this should be that guiding force for the whole IEP. So over to Ari.
So, Ari, when we're talking about the present levels of performance, I'm just going to touch on it really quick because I know we are getting low on time. But we know that Ari is an active student. They're involved in the YMCA. They complete assignments, but they need a little bit of extra time. They're at a fourth grade reading level and they need help with functional math skills. And one of our strengths is social interaction and loves working with children. So we will move on to the next section and we will use some of that information again here in a minute.
All right, excellent. So we're next going to move on and talk about courses of study, right? So we talked about kind of setting the stage, the present ed levels piece, and now we're going in and talking about the courses of study and a coordinated set of activities. So coordinated set of activities are really looking at all those things that student is doing as part of their high school or middle school program if they're starting at 14, and they should be student-centered. They should be leading to what that student wants to do once they leave school. So they should be relevant. It should be a coordination with the classes they're involved with, the activities they're involved in. And if you look at those required areas, they can, with that coordinated set of activities, look at instruction, the measurable annual IEP goals, any related services that student is involved with, their community experiences, engagement in employment-related activities, daily living skill activities. And the key is that all activities should connect directly to what that student wants to do once they leave school. That's the important piece.
So for Ari's post-secondary ed goals, they are going to attend an inclusive post-secondary education program. They're going to take courses for focusing on those main things: career development, employment skills, independent living, to advance their focus on early childhood. After completing the college program, they're going to want to work in a preschool setting and live with roommates after they graduate. They want to live with roommates while in college and after college.
So again, the assessment was coming up with these post-secondary goal areas for further training, employment, and independent living. And as we mentioned, everything in this IEP should then be helping that student, in this case, Ari, get to that point. That includes the courses of study or the classes that student is taking, and that's the coordinated set of activities. So what they're doing in school should help to support what they're going to do once they leave school. And that includes for students, meeting those graduation requirements in a high school setting, as well as having activities and services to support their post-secondary outcome areas. So when you look at this and you see courses of study, that's really talking about the classes that student is involved with, including if that student is involved in a career tech ed center or in a dual enrollment classes at a community college or a college setting. And those classes should be really reflective of specific information. It shouldn't just say college prep or functional curriculum. You should really be able to identify what that student is involved with. So with Ari?
So with Ari, we're looking at, many of the same courses that the other students are taking. We've broken it down with what is required, but we've also made sure that we've addressed some of the courses that will really add and help get Ari involved in early childhood field, or even prepare to be a little bit more independent, working skills, all of that. So we really inputted a lot of those courses into their elective courses when available.
Great. And I did see a comment came in, and I do think it's important when you're looking at the IEP and especially the president levels that everything is being addressed. So both academic performance as well as functional performance.
Yes.
Because those areas really are so important. And when Minnie was talking about the programs that are offered in higher education that she was talking about, those are really crucial components for a student to be successful. So another piece of this is, in addition to the classes the student is involved with, what are the transition services and activities that are taking place with that student? And these are those action steps, those things that student is experiencing in school. So this could take the place of, exploring different jobs in the community, doing job shadowing. Maybe they're doing work type of placements either in school or in the community that's helping that young person experience what different jobs are like, what different expectations are, and if the student wants to go on to a post-secondary education program, what is preparing them to be successful. So these are these activities. They're not measurable annual goals, right? These are separate activities like exploring different options, exploring what supports are out there, understanding their disability and what accommodations and supports they need. Those are all part of those transition services and activities. It's also important to keep in mind that this shouldn't just be what's happening in special education. We should really be looking at what is happening for all students in the general education curriculum, and is that young person that does have an IEP taking advantage of the general education courses, what's offered through guidance counselors, and other activities. Many schools will map these out, but I think it's important as a family member, as a young person, really look at, is that young person engaged in all the activities that are happening in that high school? And
All right. So for Ari's activities, we've mapped them out by grade. And as you can see, there's going to be a combination of activities, not just for the school to do, but for Ari and their family to do as well. Joining clubs at schools, volunteering, getting involved again with some early childhood activities, participating in work experiences, and working on some communication skills. These are all different things that not only align with Ari's preferences, like we said, and interests, but they're going to benefit Ari in the long term when we're thinking about those post-secondary ed goals that Ari has.
Great, thanks, Mindy. So we're next moving in and talking about the measurable annual IEP goals, right? So for most young folks, they should have 3 to 5 goals. Now, students that have more complex support needs, they might have 6 or 7, but the idea here is that young person is really, as part of their IEP year are focusing on those areas that they need to work on to be most successful when they leave school. There should be baseline information. In other words, that starting point, whether it's a math goal, a behavior goal, an organizational goal, that's leading to their success. And they should be monitored, right, to show that that student is making success. This slide is really a nice way of kind of breaking that down. So when you take the IEP back and you're looking at the measurable IEP goals, you should be able to check off boxes. And you may want to take the IEP goal and take this slide and pop them in there. Do you have a condition where this is happening? Do you have a clearly defined behavior of what that young person is working on? And then do you understand it? Does the young person understand how that's going to be measured? And that should be for every IEP goal that that young person has.
Okay, so for Ari's goals, you can see we met all those criteria. I want to be sure that we have a little bit of time to go over some of the additional resources we have. So go back and look at these IEP goals afterwards. We focused on all the information that we shared earlier and based off those present levels of performance.
Great, thank you.
Uh-huh.
So the other thing that we wanted to share, and I think this slide is really crucial, is that there does need to be alignment. In other words, what the student's needs are in that description in the present ed level. There then should reflect and look at what that student wants to do once they leave school, those post-secondary goals or those outcome areas, further training, employment, independent living. How is that aligned? Then there's the measurable annual goal, and it's being monitored. The other thing along this line, you should be able to look at a measurable annual goal in an IEP and go back and find in present ed levels what's the baseline and why is that student working on that and how that aligns to their post-secondary goal area. So again, this is a nice outline or a guided chart to look at. I did want to mention too, in addition of the resources that we talked about on the NTACT website, we do have and if you use that hyperlink, and I'm just going to put this up on the screen real quickly, hopefully it pops up. Oh, come on. Hang on one second. It is not for some reason. I'm going to click off of it. If you click on that QR code, there is a really good, sorry about that. It is a really good timeline for families and young folks to look at that breaks down by age things that can be done. So highlight that, go on and scan it. It's a really nice handout.
All right. And I also linked the Think College preparing for college resource topic page, and that has tons of information for students, families, and educators, like IEP goals, suggestions for how to get students a little bit more involved and prepared for college. And some of these things would be great, not even just for college. I know we have people that were talking about just helping students become a little bit more independent, and some of our resources there will work on that as well.
Great, thank you. And then Josie, I know there's a lot of Ray's resources too.
There are indeed, and both of you, thank you so much. The feedback that we're getting was amazing. The number of questions have been so great and really kept us on our toes. And there was like a team of us trying to answer. So really excited about that. Thank you guys. And Mindy, I saw that you put your contact info in the host and panelists chat. Did you want to share that with
sorry
everyone?
about that.
Oh, it's fine. I definitely have done it like 3 times today. So no problem. So really, guys, we try to provide tools to support youth in transition, families, but most of these tools go through our parent centers. And so if you're not connected, you may not know how cool they are. So feel free to go to our raisecenter.org and get some of these resources. There are some good materials here. They are on websites, apps. We talked about the Yen site. We would love for you to get on there and let us know if there's something else that you see that we should be developing. We are constantly looking for ideas to improve youth transition. Dina, I'm sorry because I started talking like I was auctioning her. But like, thank you guys so much. This was great. Is there another slide?
There is another slide. It's a thank you page.
It's a thank you. But please, guys, what you saw on the previous slide was an upcoming webinar. You will be getting some more details very soon about the upcoming webinar, including the other trainings coming up. But what I didn't mention was part of what we've been working on since really the end of last year was this transition IEP toolkit. So if you go to Raise Center, you go to our resources and education, you can find this whole section on the student-led tools for their IEPs. And so you will find videos and worksheets and some information if a teacher is doing them as well. And as I mentioned in some of the Q&A, I really recommend whenever possible that the student leave whatever they can in their IEP, even if that means a slide with a pre-recorded video about who they are at home or who they want to be, any of that. So take a look at this tool. We would love for you to use whatever makes sense, and hope they can empower more youth to be self-determined and talking about their disability and what makes them them. So thank you.
And Josie, before we go, Michael was talking about NTACT's assessment guide. I just want to make sure that folks know that there is a family and young adult supplement to that guide that does provide examples. That's where you will find the great assessment examples. I want to make sure that people know that, and it's on this recording. So people go back and watch it, they know that that is where to find those awesome examples on top of everything that Michael and Mindy shared today.
And do check out the timeline, because I think that does a really nice outline of what you could be doing at home as well as in school. But thank you, Everett.
Yeah, I want to make sure I give you the right plug, Michael.
Thank you, thank you.
Great.
And just, if you want to reach out to myself or Mindy, our contact information is here. Please feel free to do that. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day. Please do our survey. I think all of us on here use that information. And if you have ideas and other info, please feel free to put it on there. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Bye.
thanks for having us.